This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is the London Fintech Podcast, episode 217, brought to you in association with Smart and the listed.board.com, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Ricardo Josua, founder and CEO at Pismo.io, a Brazilian fintech who provide core banking technology and who raised an impressive $108 million B round last year. It seems only yesterday to me that $10 million was an impressive B round. How things change. Anyway, we will hear more about Pismo later in the show, but to keep this intro short and sweet, we are here to discuss fintech in Central and South America. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good morning, Ricardo. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
It's a pleasure, Mike. Happy to be here.
So, I think I may have given the game away as to where you are, and I've mentioned Brazil once or twice, so you're a bit sort of down left from me. But in terms of geography and that, and Brazilians, my most memorable recent encounter with Brazilians was when we had one of these rare things called a holiday over the summer.
Wow.
In Santorini for a couple of weeks. And we're sitting on this beautiful restaurant overlooking the caldera. Santorini is the one that's blown up, so there's this big crater. Pretty expensive restaurant. And in the corner was this, what I assumed was kind of Italian lady. And the chap with her was proposing to her. So, of course, Bridget being a girl and all sort of local girls were sort of, oh, wow, gosh, how nice. I'm thinking, yeah, right. And anyway, she's sort of blurting out tears. So Bridget after a while said, oh, she's crying for quite a lot. I said, yeah, these Italians, they're like that. And it was about 10 minutes later and she was still crying. So that's a bit strange, even by Italian standards. And anyway, long story short, so that was just a bit of a mystery. But then we got up to go and we got chatting to them, and Bridget had taken some photos and they were exchanging the photos and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, it turns out that they were actually both Brazilian with quite a nice backstory. They were both firefighters, actually. And she had learnt from the other chap, had been her instructor on how to fight a fire and all that kind of stuff. Oh, in about 7 years before. And they'd known each other for quite a long time and they got together. And then, long story short, they got engaged in Santorini at literally the adjacent table to us. So from that, I can derive that I have to be careful not to sort of say anything too romantic, because otherwise you might burst into tears for a while. Although, actually, to be fair, he didn't. She did.
Well, or sound Italian by the looks of it. So I'll be careful with that.
Yeah, exactly. Any sort of swarthy types who looks like Mediterranean or Mediterranean spin-offs like we have down in South America. But zooming in on Brazil, at the opposite end from romantic moments, I don't know if it's a romantic moment or not, but you had an election just recently, which was pretty close, very near 50-50, and ever since the fortification of the election in the part that's sort of above Central America, most recently, I'm always a little bit, as many people are, a little bit suspicious when these things come out at 50.1 and 49.9% or whatever the overall number was. And in fact, talking about the collapsing world that is the UK, I do remember the woman who was a former mistress of Johnson's or something, about 5 prime ministers ago now, Boris Johnson. He was having an affair with him, I think, about the time of the Brexity stuff. And it was pretty much suppressed, but she would go around telling people afterwards that it was a way bigger difference, but they just fixed the numbers to look a bit more respectable. So I have no idea. Anyway, of course, Brazil being a completely uncorruptible country, 50.1 and 49.9 are very similar. But in Europe, we've noticed, the more observant have noticed, that Ukraine is a couple of countries. There's the West Ukraine and then there's sort of the eastern side of Ukraine, the different lots of people. But from what little I saw about the Brazilian elections, it was pretty geographically separated, in that the northeast voted for one gentleman and the sort of the rest voted for the rest. So do you want to give us a sort of an idiot's guide to sort of Brazil geography or politics or elections?
Sure. Primer. Do we have 3.5 hours?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it'd be more interesting than all this sort of...
All right. So in 1500...
It's an appropriate start for one on South America, because politics in South America do vary more than they tend to do in Europe.
Exactly. I think, one of the things that gets Brazilians a little angry or frustrated often is that, even the lumping of countries in South America as, or even, below the US as Latin American or South American, as if it were, something that had unity in itself is sort of frustrating. Because, of course, for those who don't remember their schools days, the obvious proximity is that we were colonized by Portuguese and Spanish, largely, with a few exceptions in the Guianas. And, of course, most countries speak Spanish because of that. They pretty much got their independence around the same time, early 1800s. Brazil was NT'd in 22. But Brazil is still, the only country that speaks Portuguese. So we don't speak the language of the other Latin American countries. And after the independence, some of the countries in Spanish America sort of broken down into smaller countries, went through civil wars and a bunch of other messy affairs. And now we ended up with a very diverse, not only in terms of population and sort of distribution, from where the migration came from, the proportion of Native Americans within local populations, geography, changes, vastly from the Ushuaia, in Chile to Venezuela. You can find, countries that are nothing like each other. And of course, in terms of politics, although there have been general themes, towards the left after the Second World War, and then movement to the right on the later part of the 20th century, and then sort of a resurgence of the left in the early aughts and 2010, and then now a resurgence of the populist right-wing voters. And then in Brazil, we had, as you said, an election between Jair Bolsonaro, who was dubbed by The Economist the Trump of the tropics. So this sort of far-right guy, pro-establishment, although he was a congressman for most of his life. And on the other side, Lula, which is the leftist party, most important figure in Brazil. He was imprisoned on corruption charges a while ago. He was released because the judge that led his conviction was found partial. So, it's a messy situation. And of course, as many other countries worldwide, and it's no different in South America now, polarization has reached the paroxysm, right? We got to a point where, families were not talking to each other, and, a lot of division in the streets. We had sort of people, brandishing, firearms. Just the day before the election, one of the senators of Brazil, got sort of hassled by a guy from the other party in a restaurant in the street, and she, came running after him, sort of brandishing a gun and shooting to, the air. So that's the kind of the general feel of the election here. And then, of course, it was by a close margin. Although it's like 2 million votes, it's still, a percentage point in a country of 215 million. But yeah, it's interesting times. I think the only good thing is that, at least for the case of Brazil, in most cases in South America now, the institutions are largely sort of taking the brunt of the descent and sort of surviving it to a large extent, with few exceptions and notable exceptions.
Excellent. And yes, as you say, we could spend a considerable time zooming into Brazilian politics, and probably most of us learn a hell of a lot. I mean, just from the external perspective, the major global dynamic in 2022 is the apparent dissolution of the globalist American empire, the so-called GAY, and the emergence of a multipolar world with, Russia, China and India certainly count themselves as civilization states, and the BRICS as a whole. Is there an enormous difference in policy between the two presidential candidates there as to whether, should we say, one leans towards America or the other one leads towards the multipolar world, and the BRICS saying, look, do you know what, we're going to do things our own way, thank you very much, enjoy your decline over there?
I think, in Brazil and many countries, I think, the right-wing candidates have largely espoused the deglobalization of the world in one way or another. So Jair Bolsonaro here in Brazil was much farther from international politics than his predecessor. So Lula yesterday gave his first speech and mentioned, that we Brazilians want to be protagonists in the world stage, and had, and I think this is also interesting to note, one of the first calls that he got yesterday were from Biden and Sarkozy, and then followed by that, Xi Jinping also sent, we're very happy, it's going to be great, because we have now a Democrat in the US, and Jair Bolsonaro didn't even recognize Biden at first, because he thought the election was rigged because of Trump. So we have this interesting situation where the leftist government in Brazil has a more globalist approach, which is, I guess, interesting and in a certain way novel, at least for me. We've seen more protectionist left governments as the norm, and we're seeing now a more globalist left party taking power. So it will be interesting to see in the next years.
Yes, long-term listeners to the podcast will know that one of my pet hates is that the words left and right as meaning absolutely anything in politics.
Yeah.
When I was a lad, left meant concern for the working class, anti-Americanism, anti-war, anti-militarism, a bunch of stuff I entirely agreed with. Now I'm a little bit older, I'm quite a grown-up lad by now. Left stands for neoliberalism, corporatism, America, and spending lots of money on wars. Anyway, let's put that to one side. So that's a bit of an introduction to where you're coming from. Now, just very, very briefly, your career journey. In terms of being Brazilian, I assume that was actually one of the easier things for you to achieve, in which is that you came out of the womb and you were sort of Brazilian. Well, that bit was sort of fairly straightforward. And maybe we sort of zoom past the sort of the early years and get back to sort of the professional career, maybe sort of, I don't know, 20s onwards or something. How come you're here today or there today?
Sure. So I started my career as an investment banker. So yeah, well, I'm sorry if you're losing listeners from now on, but I recanted and I later left investment banking I was working for. And looking lo and behold, this was CS First Boston. So, well, I guess they took a while to miss me, but now my absence there is being made felt. So yeah, I started there. Actually, I started in a bank in Brazil called Garantia. That was the partnership emulating Goldman Sachs, created by Jorge Paulo Lemann, who is now one of the owners of AB InBev, the brewery and beverage company. Probably the richest guy in Brazil, maybe in Latin America. So this guy had this bank was acquired by Credit Suisse, and in 1999 I left to co-found my first company. It was a card processing company in Brazil. Back in the day, no venture capital, no cute jargon calling this TechFin or Fintech or anything like that. Everything pretty much bootstrapped. But it was a great experience. I worked there for 13 years, almost 14. Then left to do other stuff, including ed tech and some business and finance to cover for the ed tech part. And that eventually in 2015, my previous CTO at my first company left and sort of called me and said, listen, we were comparing ourselves to some of the older companies in the US. In our case there, it was like, Fiserv, First Data, TCs. And those companies seemed like, the paramount of evolution, but they were still using mainframes. And I just visited, some companies in California, and they have bean bags everywhere. And they all drink margaritas during the workout. So, we need to understand how they're doing this. Seems very exciting. Yeah, and we started Pismo. So, we started the company in late 15, sort of among friends. And then we got a seed round in late 16 to actually start the company. We left our previous ventures and started doing that. That's been 6 years now.
Ah, excellent. Well, we'll come on to Pismo a bit more in the dessert course of the show. But the essence I take away is that you've got a Pucker FS background and then you've been a serial entrepreneur for quite some time. Now, as you say, Brazil is perhaps anomalously Portuguese in Latin America, largely to do with the Treaty of Tortilla, that whichever pope it was signed, which sort of says, anyway, there's this line in the sand and everything east of there is Portuguese, being the west side of Brazil, and everything west of there is Spanish. And actually, I did spend some time researching this because for some reason I got it mentioned in the book or something. But there appeared to be two hypotheses about how the Portuguese discovered Brazil, one of which is they kind of decided to discover it and went over there, and the other which is they were just going down Africa and got a bit blown off course. And I did spend some time looking into this, and I never actually really managed, just my own satisfaction, to work out why in terms of the documentation of the evidence at the time. I mean, to be honest, if you're trying to go down West Africa, which the Portuguese were quite good at back in the day, and they're certainly one of the first to do that kind of thing, 15th century or whenever it was, it's quite a bit of a way to be blown off course to end up in Brazil, isn't it, really? So, but do you happen to know why you speak Portuguese now, for example? Was it an accident or was it intentionally centuries back ago?
Well, I guess it's make believe. I think the African journey went awry. I think is still the canonical version, as far as I know. And I have heard about this. How come this the most experienced navigators in the world would make such an egregious mistake. But remember, they were trying to get through the other side, so they didn't have to go through the Cape of Good Hope in the south of Africa. So they wanted to get ways to get to either to India or Africa, from the other side of the earth, and they already had the notion that you could navigate from the other side. So could have been that, but then again, I guess we'll never know.
I claim to be one of the people who had one of the last meetings with a Portuguese colonial central banker. Back in the day, I had a meeting with the governor of the Central Bank of Macau. Which was really interesting.
Yeah.
And he looked archetypally Portuguese. He had the little sort of, 15th century beard and the works, actually. Really cool, actually. Far more mellow than the central banker in Hong Kong.
Right.
But anyway, let's put the history to one side. People know a little bit about that. Just in terms of strict definitions, I kind of confused Scandinavia and the Nordics until I was told off that obviously Finland isn't Scandinavia and obviously it's the Nordic. Oh, right, okay. So I hesitate to suggest where the line would be drawn on that sort of thin bit that suddenly goes fat and Central America turns into South America. But to what extent is there such a thing in reality as Central America and South America, and where's the dividing line? Was it just literally a geographical term? I mean, do you in your own mind, do you actually as a Brazilian think about, us South Americans and, the Central Americans?
No, there's no such identity.
Everything below America is a bit more sane and a bit more insane in different ways.
A bit more insane, of course, but or in some sense insane as well. But, I think there's no clear, at least in my perception, there's no clear distinction from being South American versus Latin American. I don't feel, especially because in the northern part of South America, there are some odd sort of peaks there. And when you get to the islands, and so of course, maybe there are Caribbean islands and those nations that are sort of set apart from more ways of, governing in the same kind of, situations we have in terms of independence. Those could probably be construed as a separate unit, more so than, I guess, Central American countries versus South American countries. But again, I don't see this in discourse. Usually, what I do see is that neighboring countries within South America tend to have, varying degrees of migration, but to some extent, especially in Spanish-speaking South America. So just to give you a concrete anecdote, and of course, by no means statistical information, but we have clients in, for example, Chile, where you find that, several of the executives and people working with us there are from either Argentina or Paraguay or Uruguay, but largely Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. So that you see a lot. So in this sort of more southern section of South America, there's a lot of migration, sort of internal migration. So between Uruguay, Chile, Chile and Argentina, you see more. And of course, on the northern parts as well. And there's, of course, Bolivians in Brazil. But again, the language barrier in Brazil makes us sort of a more separate. So I think the only relevant separation here is maybe Caribbean, and of course, Brazil from the rest. Brazil, because of language mostly, is a very separate entity, and because of the makeup of the population as well. I think Portuguese in Brazil were especially nasty and were able to decimate most of the native Indian population in Brazil. So we have less of that than some other countries in other parts of the continent.
Yes, and Thomas Sowell is always banging on about the fact that America didn't import, quotes, that many slaves, himself being a descendant of slaves, of course. So I don't think it's been inappropriate. And actually, a hell of a lot went down south, far more to Brazil centuries ago. And I've probably missed something here, actually, which wouldn't be the first time. It may surprise you to hear. And so a bit like Scandinavia and the Nordics, it's obviously different. I go, right, okay. So does Latin America then mean everything below kind of the bottom of...
Yeah, below, I think Mexico down would constitute Latin America. I think the Caribbean islands are sort of part of Central America in a sense, but I guess based on their nation statuses and how they evolved in terms of independence, later independences, or relationship with different countries other than Spain and Portugal, they are sort of a unit apart. Geographically, they would be part of Latin America, but I think culturally, they are a different breed of countries than the rest of Latin America. I think that's the only distinction. And again, within Latin America, there's a clear difference between Brazil and the rest because of the language barrier and because we are Portuguese versus Spanish
Yes, it's all very confusing to a bear of little brain who didn't really like geography at school anyway. I mean, I get confused, frankly, by the American phrase. It's one of their major blocks of Hispanics. And I always wonder who Hispanics are. If you're Portuguese today, is that Hispanic, or does it mean Latin American, or and Portuguese and Spanish? I mean, it's utterly confusing. Yet it's this major block of there's whites, and then there's blacks, and there's Hispanics, and I don't know what to actually call the rest. And then there's something not a polite word, I'd have thought.
And it's confusing for us because when I go to the US, am I Latino? I don't speak Spanish, for one, but my descendants largely European. So I don't know. So in theory, I'm a minority in the US, so I can get quotas there, I guess.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm a minority in London these days, but that's a different story entirely. Anyway, so let's get on to the fintechy stuff. And I don't know how many countries there are, even excluding the Caribbean, in what I used to think of as Central and Southern America, but I shall call Latin America for the rest of the podcast. But in terms of the major players, where you thought you might give us a little bit of a feel and a tour d'horizon of really what's sort of hot in those areas before diving into things from a bit more sort of sectorally or background. You'd mentioned that sort of the ones that the listeners really ought to know a little bit about are Mexico, Brazil, Chile and Argentina. So maybe you'd like to go through in turn and give us a little bit of a feel for them.
So, there are 33 countries in Latin. Of course, I don't know enough to go over each of them in turn. I can share some of my experiences with some of these countries that I have relationships with and that I know more about. And of course, if you take Mexico and Brazil alone, you get a large chunk of the population. So Latin American population is about 640 million, 650 million, something along those lines. Brazil is 215, and Mexico, I think it's another 140, 30. So, if you take Mexico and Brazil out, you already have sort of more than half of the continent already. And in terms of economic value creation, it's not that different as well. So, and in terms just of, say, venture-backed investments, just to give you a sense, the last I saw, and this is a 2020 data, so it might be a little outdated, but Brazil had like 60% roughly of total investments in fintech in the continent. So, although there are, 30 plus countries and a huge swath of population distribution within the continent, many countries were just too small to receive a lot of attention from international investors. So have developed a smaller fintech environment. In the case of Brazil, I think it's been largely. I'll start with Brazil because it's the easiest one for me. Then I'll go over to the others. Brazil has had a very, very forward-thinking central bank. So starting in mid-aughts, so 2007, 2008, after the financial crisis in the US, they started enacting a number of regulations allowing new players to enter the market. And then again, doubling down in 2013, they sort of broken some of the duopolies that were very common in this region. Even today in Argentina, for example, there are a couple of issuers and processors for cards. There are limits for the number of players who can be certified. In Mexico, everyone has to be certified under a specific tier registration with the central bank. And Brazil has been sort of one of the most lax regulation structures in order to incentivize the growth of financial services through fintechs and new players. So in Brazil, a vast amount of underbanked population. And by the way, now just so your listeners know, these estimates will vary, but roughly 55% of the population in Latin America is either underbanked or unbanked, has no bank accounts at all.
Just on that point, because we had a fintech from Nigeria on the show a couple of months ago, which equally is Africa's largest country by quite a long way. And they have, I think, off the top of my head, a much higher percentage of so-called unbanked or non-banked. But one of the issues we got into there, which was this whole sort of banked business is a very sort of first worldy thing, and actually the real problem is not that they lack bank accounts, it's the problem they lack money in the first place. They're just very poor. That the income distribution in Africa is very different from, let's say, Europe or even in America. So I would assume that given the mixed sort of backgrounds of the various populations and the uneven development, that one of the phenomena there isn't that you've just got a bunch of ex-First Bostoners who for some reason have lost their bank account, but you've got people who actually don't really have any money anyway. So the fact that unbanked is a little bit by the by.
It's an interesting argument. I think that, I don't want to talk about the African continent because I don't have enough information, but I can tell about Latin America. Of course, there's huge inequality here in most countries. Although I think, the vast majority of countries now have some sort of income distribution program. I can talk, in more detail about this in Brazil. Brazil has, and again, I know this in pounds now, it's not even that much more, but we have stipends for low-income families that will guarantee them an income of 600 Brazilian reais, which is about $120. And it sounds like very little, but, this already puts them above the lowest poverty line, which is very little money, but it's, about $4 a day. And that is enough to have. But, the interesting thing is that during the pandemic, just to give you a sense, we had an increase in circulation of cash because people would get the benefits from the government and they would sort of withdraw the whole amount and use it in actual cash. So even though we had major lockdowns across the country during the pandemic where digital banking had everything to grow, we had an increase in the volume of cash being circulated in the economy, which is counteressential.
Yes, so there's an unbanked issue, but also there's a poverty issue, and those percentages are, as you might imagine, radically different from, let's just say, West Africa, where off the top of my head, in Nigeria, for Piggyvest, their addressable marketplace and their minimum investment was $1 on the app, was about 5% of the country. So there, the income distribution drops off. However, you've got hundreds of million people, 50% of whom are banked, put it in that context, in terms of looking at the fintech marketplace, just from the perspective of fintech as a business, and not sort of sociology degrees or geography degrees. So there's a very large market there in Brazil, and I assume in many of the other countries as well, for 21st century tech products in FS.
100%. And again, we have data for that. So Nubank, which is sort of the most well-known fintech, certainly in Latin America, one of the largest in the world today. Just to give you a sense of comparison, they have 65 million regular clients. 80% of those use this as a primary bank. And most of those didn't have a bank account before setting up this account with Nubank. And Nubank is now operating out of Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, and increasing, expanding to other countries. But they are servicing, again, these clients which have savings, and we process a part of their savings accounts. And some savings accounts will sort of accrue interest on them on a £2 balance or a £3 balance, a daily interest accrual on that. So there's no lower limit. And, these guys they had to pay for their accounts or pay for additional services and bank transfers. And now they have those options. So these players have become extremely important for the extension of services and the digitalization of their services, both in terms of security and access to financial products. Remember that the world now is suffering from inflation, but for Brazilians, this is sort of just another Wednesday, right? We've been dealing with different, varying levels of inflation for a very long time. Our target inflation was 4.5% a year. Now, of course, it's even better than some developed countries, but it's still, 8%, 6% a year, depending on how you calculate it. And, having savings that can bear interest, even on your 5 or 10 pounds, will make a difference by the end of the month. So, I'm mostly a cynical person myself, but I think this has made a huge difference. And it was largely because the central bank allowed unlicensed structures to provide those services without the same cost structures and rails that were set up for larger financial institutions.
Yes, that's a dynamic we see around the world, which is that the state in all its infinite metastasizing guises has this thing called a financial regulator, and the financial regulator says, we're here to protect people. And they balloon their costs, and they set up barriers to entry and all that, with the best will in the world.
Yeah.
It ends up being counterproductive. Okay, so look, let's just rattle through these four then.
Sure. I think, in Argentina is living through a very complicated situation now. We are now working with a company with the neobank there. Very hard situation. It's called Brew Bank. And I think this is an up-and-coming solution that is, facing very strong headwinds, but, making very important advances in the market. In Chile, we are working with a digital wallet, and we see that digital wallets the ones we saw growing very much in China and then in some countries in Southeast Asia are also being replicated there. So there's a company called FPay from a retail that has now millions of clients that use this as a QR code enabled digital wallet to make payments. And I think this is an interesting advance for a country where, again, there's a lot of cash payments still being made. So digital wallets are a thing in some of the countries. It hasn't taken off in every single country in the world, but in some regions it has become very important in smaller countries as well. In Mexico, I think it's it's the second most important market in Latin America, and I think we have their regulatory structure for creating a structure to operating within new rails and new regulations, right? So we have fintechs like Kavak is sort of an older company, right? And deals to Pismo with Bitcoin. And you have even Nubank, which is a Brazilian company that has operations now in Mexico. So it's a thriving environment, a challenging one, but a very thriving one. And now with supporting regulatory infrastructure to operate in.
Excellent. Well, moving on from the sort of horizontal looking at the countries to the more sort of vertical factors. We've mentioned one or two already, obviously the sort of historical differences, the ethnic income distribution differences. You've touched on the differential regulatory stances and how that's impacted the growth or otherwise in the various countries. What other sort of factors from a horizontal perspective do you think that would help the listener understand the sort of topology of fintech? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, that China, obviously after its Maoist revolution, basically had no banks and being communist. So they leapt right forwards to go to fintech because there was no consumer lending. As we know in Africa, M-Pesa came out of pretty much thin air because nobody trusted the banks because they were all corrupt and in the hands of the government, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got geography, history, the economic distribution, a regulatory perspective. Presumably also the corruption will vary from country to country and the sort of the several dozen that comprise the whole of Latin America. What do you think the major factors have been cutting through all countries that sort of mean that this country will lean more or less towards fintech?
Maybe before I answer that, just a quick, fintech is a very broad term, of course, and I'm sure your listeners know. So I think in Latin America, there are two I would separate this in two different sort of buckets here, right? One is payments and rails, so connections. So people have deposit accounts and can transfer money from those accounts either to A2A or direct payments or cards or whatever other instrument. So they have access to modern technology. They can buy online and they can use money without depending on cash on physical cash. And the second one is much more complicated, which is lending structures in various formats. We have companies like Creditas, who is extending secured loans, which were very hard to find and come by in many of the countries. So I think there are very different problems and there are very different solutions for those. As you said, there are some verticals that will cut through both of this, and I think the first and foremost is regulation. Having a forward-leaning central bank and regulatory body will make a huge difference. And again, you mentioned the Brazilian central bank, and I can say that even given all the sort of corruption scandals and problems that Latin American countries face regularly, central banks have been lauded for their initiatives in most of this. So they have actually built stuff that works and that increased access. And the data is very, very promising. So I think they have done, a very good work, especially the ones that have managed to keep independent from government. So regulation is the first one. The second one is, how stable those economies will be. Because, for the second part of the component that was mentioned there, so payments is easier, but, in lending and even savings, a volatile economy will hurt smaller companies much faster. The more stable an economy is, the easier it is to be. I think corruption is not playing a major role now. These companies are largely venture-backed or, sort of starting from scratch. So they don't carry all the legacy structures, and corruption still lingers more on the public sector or on state-owned companies. So I think, that doesn't seem to be a problem that I see in most countries. So I think, if we have minimum stability, even now with the changing market trends, I think these companies will survive and strive. So I think those two teams are the most important for me.
Excellent. So in terms of the expansion issue before, as we've discussed with various countries in various parts of the world, actually. If you're a tiny little country of next to no population, you have to expand because there isn't much of a market. If you're a vast country, be it, I don't know, China or America, say, there's no great rush to expand whatsoever. If you're somewhere in the middle, which tend to be the sort of Scandinavia, your local population is enough to make money and get going and try things and work out what works, and then you expand. And I assume that, of course, it's going to be very differential depending on the country. I mean, Brazil is so big that even if you sort of 50% of the population are banked, well, that's still way more than the UK already. So presumably, if you're a successful Brazilian fintech, unless you're going for a fairly small niche, you don't have a great pressure to expand. And I assume that if you're in a Spanish-speaking country, you just go to the next door Spanish-speaking country because it sort of must be relatively like, by and large, as a generalization. So which of Latin American fintechs do you think are going global and have made their mark outside Latin America?
Not that many. I think the only one that comes to mind is neobank. Of course, there's Mercado Libre, which is a huge company at this point that has sort of spanned through the whole of the subcontinent. I think there's very, very few examples of companies that have thrived outside of Latam. I think I should mention here that my company is one of those exceptions. We are now doing
I was
business.
about to say, what about this company I've heard of called Pismo? They're supposed to be quite
Exactly,
good.
yeah. So I think we're working with core replacement solutions. So, we're taking companies on a process that is generational. So, the services that we provide are extremely sticky and extremely hard to move, especially for incumbent players. So I think, if it were just for, fintechs and new players, we could really, stay here and focus on in Brazil alone even. But since part of our business comes from incumbents and these conversations take a very long time, the decision process can take a year. And then the process for migrating now, we're just migrating a very large bank in Europe and US. And the project itself is multi-year just to deploy. So, we are in the process of doing this secular trend of replacing mainframes with cloud solutions. And if we're not there now, we'll lose largely due to timing. So that was the reason we rushed to get other markets while we're still growing in Latin America. And by the way, just one point to what you said, I think some listeners might find interesting. I've been telling people something that was extremely interesting for me, that it took us much, much, much less time to deploy our services in India than in Argentina, by almost an order of magnitude. So, being geographically close or, having a similar language does not account for that much. The nature and the maturity of the rails, the players and the ecosystem that is available for connections makes a huge, huge difference. And we see that elsewhere. Even connecting to the UK faster payments or to SEPA, there are, a thousand of opportunities of, using existing components and building, alongside those. And for countries that are not as mature, you have to build everything from scratch, and it takes much longer. And you end up with a country with sort of a smaller population and smaller, consumer base. So.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like it's time to turn on to Pismo, because not only have you been kind enough as a CEO and co-founder to tell the listeners all about Latin America, and therefore ought to tell the listeners about your products and services in case anyone needs them, but you are, as you say, one of the few globally expanding Latin American fintechs. So that sets precedent as well. But before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all you listeners out there, particularly listeners in Central and Southern Latin America, Caribbean, whichever one is which. I'm glad there isn't a short test afterwards. And my brand partners for the podcast, Smart is transforming pensions and retirement worldwide. Their leading-edge retirement tech platform propelled them to success in the UK. Now they're operating on 4 continents and working with partners like Zurich and JP Morgan. Find out more at www.smart.co. Then listedboard.com, your guide to entrepreneurial governance and how you can start making your board an engine of growth today. Okay, so maybe we should go back to basics with Pismo. I just sort of said you do core banking technology, which will get some sort of members of the audience sexually aroused and might send the rest of them to sleep. But maybe more specifically, you can let the listeners know what your products and services are, which countries you're active in, and which listeners should be checking you out before moving on to tell us a little bit about how you could be even bigger and better in a year's time if you only had more X, Y, or Z?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you, Mike. It was a great pleasure. So yeah, we are a platform, and again, I don't want to make your listeners snooze through this, but we are a platform for newer technologies, providing services for banks and fintechs when they're building their financial services product. So it could be a core banking replacement, it could be a neobank like N26 that uses our services, or it can be a large incumbent bank. We are now providing services in Europe. We have offices in London and Bristol. We have offices in Austin in the US. We have offices in Singapore and India, of course, and Brazil. So, we are very excited to share some of the stories and successes we had with some of our clients. If people are interested, they can visit our site at pismo.io or reach out to us directly. We love having these conversations, even if you're not, as you said, sexually aroused with the idea. I can tell you something, core banking is not a very sexy theme, or payments or card issuing. I can tell you that we are the most sexy thing in that space. So, there's that, right? That's the silver lining. So, it's been a pleasure. And I really hope that, people who are looking for new solutions or to modernize their current solutions, reach out to us and we can help modernize your bank or financial institution.
And just to wrap up, you say that you've got offices around the world, so you're increasingly a global fintech that's started in Brazil, and definitely not sort of a national or regional one. But in terms of being even bigger and better tomorrow, when your C round is presumably $1 billion, given that your B round was 100 million, what do you need more of in a year's time to be even bigger and better than you are today? I mean, apart from the obvious, or more clients is always nice.
Yeah, I think, what we're doing now is we are increasing our pace of adoption. We are creating a sales machine that we didn't have. So we were a product first company. So we built a product and now clients are increasingly using it. We are now used several billion times a day. We, move around for our clients, on behalf of our clients, about $150 billion every year. So, it's growing, 2 digits every quarter. So it's an exciting time. And I think now capital would go into increasing our footprint in these markets where we're now growing. We're very excited with Southeast Asia and India. We are very excited about Europe and increasingly excited about the US. We'll be announcing new stuff very, very soon.
Excellent. Well, that's been a very kind overview. The time has flown by. And as always, it's very interesting in the early 20th century to look at this interface between the localism and the globalism, certainly from an economic perspective, I don't mean at a geopolitical perspective, and see how companies are crossing that bridge. So I congratulate you and all your Pismo folk on their great success in the past, and I wish you and them even more success in the future.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, and thank you for all the listeners who spent this time with us.
Thanks for listening. If you're in need of a non-executive or advisory director with deep expertise, experience and contacts in the worlds of both traditional FS and fintech, or unique insight into how to make your board an engine of growth today, contact me at mike@mikeballiman.com. If you just need one-off advice in these areas, via clarity.fm/mikeballiman.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in line between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight dance.